All the odds after May 5 were in Buckner's favour, an inferior foe defending against his own superiority in the number and quality of his troops, as well as in supply and in control of the air above and sea surrounding Okinawa. Caught between 4 American divisions to his front, with another in reserve and a garrison division also available behind them, and in his rear a 7th Veteran Division, pounded from land, sea and sky, hopelessly isolated and cut off from reinforcement or supplies, with the Kikusui attacks of no help on land, Ushijima's 32nd Army could either be starved into submission or, if surrender was still so unthinkable to samurai such as Ushijima, Cho and Yahara, compelled to make a final glorious sally that would be broken in blood ending in mass suicide. Meanwhile, with the Minatoga opportunity rejected as unfeasible, General Buckner still had to face the growing and open disenchantment of Admirals Spruance and Turner with the slow progress of 10th Army on land. Turner had repeatedly urged on Buckner the necessity for a quick conquest to relieve the terrible pressure of the Kikusui on the concentration of American ships off Okinawa. For such a huge body of vessels to remain so long as plainly visible targets of a suicidal enemy was indeed unprecedented in military history. This, of course, was not entirely the fault of General Buckner, but rather enemy policy, in a sense, to bleed all over the Americans and thus drown them in Japanese blood. Again, this was small comfort to either Spruance or Turner. Buckner's reply to the Expeditionary Force commander was that he was moving slowly in an effort to save lives. To Admiral Spruance this was not a convincing argument, for he wrote, "I doubt if the Army's slow, methodical method of fighting really saves any lives in the long run. It merely spreads the casualties over a longer period. The longer period greatly increases the naval casualties when Japanese air attacks on ships is a continuing factor. There are times when I get impatient for some of Holland, Howlin' Mad, Smith's Drive." Spruance was right. Lives are definitely not saved by a carefully slow assault. They are merely spread out in time, but in the end the number of casualties is the same or almost so. If an assaulting unit comes to, say, an enemy .47 anti-tank position protected by machine guns, thus making it impossible for supporting tanks to advance, and decides to call for artillery to knock it out before attacking, in the subsequent assault it will almost certainly discover that shells simply cannot pulverize strong and clever defences. Foot soldiers will still have to go in there with hand weapons, with flamethrowers, grenades and satchel charges, and the time lost waiting for artillery to destroy the position will have been wasted, and their casualties will be the same as if they had attacked instantly. Even General Buckner himself, on May 1st, had acknowledged at a press conference that Okinawa would fall only to tactics he described as corkscrew and blowtorch, the corkscrew being explosives and the blowtorch flamethrowers and napalm. But all of these have to be aimed close up, visible. They cannot be fired from a mile or more to the rear in an arc, which would be like skipping stones on water. Because every defensive position has a mouth or aperture through which its weapon can be fired, bullets, grenades, satchel charges or flame have to be hurled, thrown or squirted through these openings. Again, close up. Even napalm will skid, and because it is always dropped from an airplane, it has about as much chance to enter a foot-by-foot or even a 2 feet by 2 feet opening as has a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Go ahead, ask the question, what's the difference, slow or speedy, if the results are the same? The answer is that the time lost will extend the exposure of a supporting fleet such as Spruance's to the assaults of the Kikusui, and also delay the departure of such naval forces to participate in another amphibious invasion elsewhere, or release the fast carriers to strike homeland Japan. Finally, slow, careful land assaults could delay the entire Pacific timetable to the great pleasure of the enemy, for the one thing Japan could not afford to waste in the spring of 1945 was time. Spruance and Turner could not forget what had happened to the escort carrier Liscombe Bay at Makin, when 6,500 GIs moving slowly took a week to conquer a weak position in an operation that should have been finished in hours. Ordinarily, Liscombe Bay would have been long gone from the impact area, but the ship was sunk on the last day by an enemy submarine, with extensive loss of life. Similarly, because of slow progress on Okinawa, ships and many seamen and seagoing marines were being lost daily on the Hagushi anchorage. The admirals were also anguished by and ever mindful of the ordeal of their men, these unsung heroes, aboard those exposed ships, especially those of the radar picket line scourged by hundreds of kamikaze and baka. They were blown into the ocean, either to drown or pass agonizing hours awaiting rescue and the ministrations of medical soldiers. Those who survived went for days on end without sleep, their nerves exposed and quivering like wires stripped of insulation. Lying wide-eyed on their bunks, they waited to hear the dreaded telltale click and static of the ship's bullhorns being activated, like a starter's gun sending them leaping erect and running so that they were already in motion when the shrill, strident notes of general quarters burst in their ears. Men in the boiler rooms worked in intense heat. The superheaters, built to give the quick pressure needed for sudden high-speed manoeuvring under aerial attack, were often kept running 3 or 4 days at a time, though they had been made for intermittent use. But it had to be that way, for the war off Okinawa was war at a moment's notice. Very little time separated that moment when radar screens became clouded with pips of approaching bogies, and the shrieking kamikaze pilots came plunging to the attack. An attempt to give the crews more warning of enemy approach had to be abandoned, one war correspondent reported. The strain of waiting, the anticipated terror, made vivid from past experience, sent some men into hysteria, insanity, breakdown. Similar reports reaching Admiral Nimitz led him to request from MacArthur the return of most of the ships of the 7th Fleet he had so generously loaned the Southwest Pacific Chief at the start of the Leyte campaign. He wanted to relieve some of Spruance's ships, but MacArthur had already protected himself against compliance with this agreed-upon condition by deliberately committing these vessels, as well as the 11th Air Force and the 8th Army, to a useless campaign in the southern Philippines in order to prevent their scheduled transfer to Nimitz. Such tactics, of course, were nothing new in World War II. During the Battle of the Bulge, General George Patton deliberately committed his beloved 4th Armoured Division to an unnecessary battle to prevent its being taken from him by General Omar Bradley, who had already commandeered his 10th Armoured Division. But MacArthur's move was the soul of ingratitude for Nimitz's generosity, and it was compounded by the general's return to his old, discredited theme of minimal losses by comparing the ease and low casualties of his southern Philippine campaign, again against mud and logs and fragmented troops, to 10th Army's higher losses moving through steel concrete and coral defences manned by soldiers determined to fight to the death. Because of this typical MacArthurian selfishness, the scourging of the 5th Fleet continued. In fairness to Buckner, the defensive complex into which he was plunging straight ahead could not be reduced in any other way than corkscrew and blowtorch. But the attack could have been more impetuous and spirited, less dependent on what General William Westmoreland in Vietnam a generation later excoriated as the firebase psychosis, i.e., a tendency to stop at every obstacle and call for artillery. But it also must not be forgotten that Buckner summarily rejected the one opportunity for manoeuvre on Okinawa, the envelopment of Ushijima's rear by a landing at Minatoga. Why will never be known, for this able, considerate and dedicated soldier did not live long enough to write his memoirs, or at least an explanation of his position. But was the straight-ahead, annihilating attack the only solution to the destruction of Ushijima's remaining 60,000 men? 10th Army had already secured and improved all the air and port facilities on Okinawa. For the Japanese, there was no way out, around, under, over, or through. Did no one suggest cutting off the enemy to let him starve? Why not emulate Nimitz's island-hopping strategy in the Pacific, leaving enemy garrisons to wither on the vine by seizing the biggest and most useful islands, while neutralizing those lying in between by aerial bombing? The Japanese could have been whittled and demoralized by constant aerial, land and sea bombardment, even goaded into those desperation, back-breaking banzai attacks so attractive to the samurai character. Doubtless they would not remain completely contained, but would sally forth in typical night forays aimed at spreading terror and destruction. But this could have only minor success. It could never have inflicted casualties among the Americans comparable to what they suffered in Buckner's final straight-ahead assault. Nevertheless, perhaps because of the importunate appeals of Spruance and Turner, who after all were his superior officers, General Buckner did quickly schedule another grand offensive for May 11th. The 96th Division back on line would be on the eastern or left flank, the 77th on its right. Next, 1st Marine Division, and then the 6th on the right or western flank. General Hodge would command his 24th Corps troops on the left and would be the tactical commander of the entire front, with Geiger leading the 3rd Corps Marines. It was typical of Geiger, whose courtesy matched Buckner's, that he did not protest the selection of Hodge as tactical chief, even though he was his senior and about to receive his 3rd star. This offensive was to be a continuation of the others with the same tactics, including the capable General Bruce's innovation of concentrating on a limited objective from which fire could be brought to bear on the enemy's reverse slope. Just before the jump-off date, however, the great Lu Chu's grey, growling and moisture-laden sky became the lord of the battlefield. On May 7th, the skies of the great Lu Chu opened with prolonged and torrential rains that reminded 1st Division Leathernecks of the month-long monsoon they had endured in the New Britain campaign. During 17 days of intermittent storms, some 15 inches of rain fell on Okinawa. Nothing could stand against it. A letter from home in the sodden pocket of a GI or Marine had to be read and reread and memorized before the ink ran, and it fell apart in less than a week. A pair of socks lasted no longer, and a pack of cigarettes became watery and uninflammable unless smoked the same day, or else, along with matches, they were kept dry within a contraceptive inside a helmet liner. Pocket-knife blades rusted together, and watches recorded the period of their own decay. Rain made garbage of the food, pencils swelled into useless pulp, fountain pens became clogged with watery ink, and their points burst apart. Rifle barrels turned blue with mould and had to be slung upside down to keep the raindrops from fouling their bores. Sometimes bullets in the rifle magazines stuck together, while machine gunners had to go over their belts daily, extracting the bullets and oiling them to prevent their sticking to the cloth loops. Everything lay damp and sodden, squishy and squashy to the touch, exuding a steady and musty reek that was the odour of decaying vegetation. To the Americans out in the open, unlike their enemies warm, dry and snug in their underground warrens, there were only 3 things of value to be found in this gurgling, gushing, rushing, streaming, dripping, drenching downpour that turned Okinawa's numerous narrow and shallow streams into raging, boiling, white torrents of water. A dry place, hot and solid food, and most of all, most unbelievably important of all, a hot cup of coffee. At sundown, before blackout discipline would be in force, among squads huddling together all over the island, tiny fires were made of the wrappings of cigarette packages and the waxed covers of K rations, and water heated in a canteen cup containing grains of K ration-soluble coffee. Thus were their bellies fortified against another cold, black, rainy night. And the rain on Okinawa made Okinawa mud. It was unique because it was everywhere, in the ears, under the nails, inside leggings, or squeezed coarse and cold between the toes. It got into a man's weapons, it was in his food, and sometimes he could feel it grinding like emery grains between his teeth. Whatever was slotted, pierced, open or empty received this mud. Wounds also. Men prayed not to get hit while rain fell and made mud. It embarrassed drivers of bulldozers and made pick-and-shovel coolies of those lordly tank troops. Some days it denied Americans the use of roads altogether, and GIs and Marines on the attack again often had to be supplied by airdrop. Frequently it was hardly possible to walk in it. A few strides and a man's shoes were coated and heavy with mud. 2 more, and they seemed as though encased in lead. A third step, and it was easier to slip out of them before the mud sucked them off and walk in it barefooted. Engineers on the airfields actually put their shoes aside and worked in sacking drawn over their feet and tied around the knees. It was this mud in which the entire 10th Army lay immobilized on the 8th of May, the day on which smeared and dripping Marines and GIs received the splendid news that Germany had surrendered. So what? They snorted in contempt. The death of Hitler and the destruction of his Third Reich meant about as much to these embattled Americans as the pardon of one condemned criminal might mean to another still under sentence of death. General Ushijima and the stubborn soldiers of his 32nd Army were their only concern, and at that very moment Ushijima was taking advantage of the rain that had stalled his enemy to strengthen his flanks, while his artillerists reminded their foe that the air still sang and shrieked with invisible death. Ushijima also reinforced the strongpoints guarding the vital 40-foot-wide east-west highway behind his barrier line, settling down to that grim step-for-step war of attrition urged on him by Colonel Yahara. Because of these defences and the incessant rain, the 10th Army drive southward on May 9th moved even slower. At the same time, the Kikusui scourging of the invasion fleet rose to a crescendo of fury. Opposing them were those Marine Corsair pilots from Yontan and Kadena who had come to the great Lu Chu expecting to fly close-up support of the ground leathernecks, only to be called to the rescue of the radar picket ships. They rowed the men down to unintended destruction away from their target vessels, sometimes even after the American pilots had expended all their ammunition. A few of them attacked the Kamikazi and Baka with their whirling propellers, just as Lieutenant Robert Klingman did in the bizarre Battle of the Frozen Guns. That was the dogfight fought at over 40,000 feet among a Japanese two-seater Nick fighter and two Corsairs piloted by Klingman and Captain Kenneth Rusa. On combat air patrol over Aeshima on May 10th, they spotted the vapor trail of the Japanese at 25,000 feet. They chased him, climbing steadily from 10,000 altitude until, after a pursuit of 185 miles, firing off most of their ammunition to lighten their load, they caught up with the Nick at 38,000 feet. They closed. Rusa shot up all his ammunition in damaging the Japanese's left wing and left engine. Klingman bored in to within 50 feet and pressed his gun button. His guns were frozen. He drove in, his propellers whirling. They chopped up the enemy's rudder and left it dangling. In the Nick's rear cockpit, the gunner was banging his fists on his own frozen guns. The Corsair's big propellers chewed on. Klingman turned and came back for another pass. He cut off the rudder and loosened the right stabilizer. He was running out of gas. He decided he didn't have enough to make Okinawa anyway and turned for a third pass. He cut off the Nick's stabilizer. The plane went into a spin, and at 15,000 feet it lost both wings and plunged into the East China Sea. Klingman started down, losing his oxygen at 18,000 feet and his power at 10,000. But he landed at Kadena Field, dead stick and on his belly, his wings and fuselage sewn with bullet holes and pieces of the destroyed Nick in his cowling. Nevertheless, the losses inflicted on the enemy aircraft did not dissuade Admiral Turner from asking Buckner once again to speed up his attack, and the 10th Army chief obliged by scheduling a massive 4-division assault for May 11th. The 10th Army had 4 full divisions abreast. General Hodges' 24th Corps was on the left, or east, with the 96th and 77th Divisions in that order, and General Geiger's 3rd Corps on the right, or west, with the 1st and 6th. The 96th's objective was Conle Hill, the 77th would buck at Shuri Castle, the 1st strike the Dakeshi Wana complex guarding Shuri, and the 6th at Sugarloaf Hill. Of these 4 objectives, those facing the Marine divisions were the strongest. Sugarloaf opposite the 6th was at least the formidable equal of the bloody meat grinder of Iwo Jima. It was not just one hill, but a complex of 3. Sugarloaf itself did not look difficult, just an oblong ridge about 50 feet high. But it was protected to its left rear by the half-moon, and on its right rear by the horseshoe, a long ridge bristling with mortars. On the left, where the 1st Division was attacking, was Shuri Heights, also stuffed with gunners who could hit the 6th on Sugarloaf as well as the 1st to their front. To attempt to get at Sugarloaf was to be hit by the others. To strike at the others was to be hit by Sugarloaf. But this was not suspected until the main position was reached on the morning of May 14th, after a fighting crossing of the Asa River and steady grinding down of smaller hills guarding the approaches. On that May 14th, most of the morning was spent evacuating Marines stricken while crossing the flat open ground approaching that harmless-looking loaf of earth. In the afternoon, a charge with supporting tanks was driven back when 3 of 4 tanks were knocked out, and artillery from Sugar's front, left rear and rear fell among the riflemen. A second assault before dusk reached Sugarloaf's base, but of 150 Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 22nd, who began it, only 40 reached the hill. They were exhausted. They were out of supplies. It was getting dusk. Suddenly, the enemy stopped firing. The men realized that someone was speaking to them. It was Major Henry Courtney, the battalion's executive officer. There was hardly a pause before the Glory Kid stepped forward, grinning. "I hate to sound like a guy in a dime novel," said Corporal Rusty Golar, "but what the hell did we come here for?" There were 19 other volunteers from this exhausted remnant, and 26 fresh men who appeared carrying supplies. Major Courtney took these 45 Marines up Sugarloaf under cover of darkness, heaving grenades as they went, digging in under the protection of their own mortars. From the Horseshoe and Half Moon came machine-gun fire and mortar shells, while grenades came up at them from the reverse slope of Sugarloaf. At midnight, Courtney heard the enemy gathering below. He decided to strike them. "Take all the grenades you can carry," he whispered. "When we get over the top, throw them and start digging in." They went out behind Courtney. They heard the Major shout, "Keep coming! There's a mess of them down there." And then they heard the explosion of the mortar shell that killed him. They answered with grenades of their own, hanging on to Sugarloaf while all of the Japanese positions struck at them, while a cold rain swept in from the East China Sea until the mists of the morning showed that there were only 20 men left of the 45 who had come up the night before. In that mist, Rusty Golar, the self-styled storybook Marine, fought the battle he had always sought. With his buddies, he was on the right flank of Sugarloaf, where he set up his light machine gun. With daylight, the Japanese on Horseshoe Hill to his right opened up on him. Golar fired back. The Japanese on Half Moon to the left opened up. With a deep, booming, "Yeah!" Golar swiveled his gun to rake Half Moon. Back and forth it went, the whip-sawing Japanese fire, the booming "Yeah" of the Glory Kid, and his own alternating bursts. It went on while Sugarloaf's defenders were gradually whittled to a handful, while men trying to bring up ammunition were killed or wounded, continuing until only Golar and a few others were left alive. By then, the Glory Kid's machine-gun belts had all been fired. He drew his pistol, yelling, "Gotta use what I got left!" He emptied it twice more. He threw it at the caves below and began scurrying about the hill crest to gather grenades from the bodies of dead Marines. "Still need some more stuff to throw at those guys," he yelled at Private Don Kelly, one of the few men still alive on the ridge. He threw. He found a loaded bar in the hands of another fallen Marine, seized it, jumped erect, and fired it until it jammed. "Nothing more to give 'em now," the Glory Kid bellowed to Kelly. "Let's get some of these wounded guys down." He bent over to pick up a stricken Marine as easily as hefting his machine gun. "I'll have you in sickbay in no time," he said in a soothing voice, and began walking toward the rear edge of Sugarloaf. An enemy rifle cracked. Rusty Golar was staggered. He put the wounded man down carefully. Incredulity was etched on his rough, slowly whitening features. He walked to a ditch and sat down in it, pushing back his helmet like a man preparing to take a snooze. And there he died. No posthumous Medal of Honor commemorates the deeds of this valiant warrior, not even another Bronze Star. He had been brave and compassionate, the twin virtues of a born fighter, and though both went unrecognized, Rusty Golar remains a legend in the annals of his gallant corps. Soon his comrades on Sugarloaf were recoiling under a thundering shower of enemy mortar shells. 3 Sherman tanks that were to have punished the enemy's reverse slope and thus clear the way for the foot soldiers were knocked out by enemy 47mm anti-tank guns, their blazing hulks incinerating the silly superstition of the near-sighted Japanese. Without this support, the Marines could not hold against renewed Japanese assaults. They withdrew, leaving behind them the still bodies of about 100 comrades, among them the burly football star George Murphy and the 45 selfless volunteers of the valorous Major Courtney, whose widow would receive his posthumous Medal of Honor. Throughout that night and the following day, the Japanese clung stubbornly to Sugarloaf, while the entire complex quivered beneath a combined air-sea-land artillery barrage preceding each American assault. But all were repulsed until, on May 17th, an end run turned the Sugars' left flank. An almost imperceptible depression had been observed running north and south between Half Moon Hill to the left and Sugarloaf. It was not actually a valley, but Japanese fire on Marines who had wandered into it had not been heavy or accurate. General Shepherd, up on the lines now, decided to move an entire regiment, the 29th, through this tiny chink in Sugarloaf's armour. 2 battalions would go through to strike at Half Moon Hill, holding there to support another battalion moving against the left face of Sugarloaf, which their own assault was expected to unmask. The battalions went forward under a fierce barrage. Half Moon Hill was hit. Sugarloaf was attacked. 3 times a company of Marines charged to Sugarloaf's crest. Each time they were driven off. They surged up a 4th time and won. But they had no more ammunition. None could be brought up to them. It was heartbreaking. They had to go down, giving up the vital height taken at a cost of 160 casualties. The next day they went up to stay. 4 days of full-scale attack, the hammering of 2 Marine regiments and supporting arms, had worn the complex's defence thin. Sugarloaf was ready to fall. Captain Howard Mabey brought his assaulting company up to the edge of the low ground opposite the hill. Artillery and mortars plastered the crest, while 3 tanks slipped around the left flank. The barrage stopped. The Japanese rushed from their caves below the reverse slope to occupy the crest. The tanks took them under fire, surprised them and riddled them. Rocket trucks raced down from the north, bumping and swaying over a saddle of ground, stopped, loosed their flights of missiles, whirled and careened away with a whine of changing gears and a roar of wasted gasoline, just avoiding the inevitable Japanese artillery shells crashing in behind them. The rockets made Sugarloaf's hillsides reel and reverberate as though a string of monster firecrackers had been set off. Artillery began again. The Marines sprinted over the field and up Sugarloaf, 1 platoon taking the right face, peeling off its fire teams, another sweeping up on the left. They met on the crest, formed and swept down the reverse slope, killing as they went. Back came the message. Send up the PX supplies. Sugarloaf is ours. It was, and it wasn't, for it took the fresh 4th Marines who had relieved the fought-out 29th 4 more days to drive deeper into the complex. The 6th Marine Division itself lost a total of 2,662 killed and wounded in this bitter battle, with another 1,289 felled by combat fatigue. In the end, after the Half Moon was taken and the 6th stood poised to drive down island into Naha, they came under plunging enemy artillery fire from the left on Shuri Heights. The 6th could not strike at Naha until the 1st destroyed the enemy on Shuri Heights. The 1st Marine Division was processing its way south. This was the cold, grim term coined by Major General Del Valle to describe the cold, grim warfare that his troops were fighting en route to Shuri Heights. Along that way lay Dekashi Ridge, Dekashi Town, Wana Ridge, Wana Draw, those now familiar, formidable jumbles of stone, steel and concrete that could only be made smooth by the processing of tank infantry flamethrower teams. These 4 places were the sentinel forts guarding the northwest way into the heart of the Naha-Shuri-Yonabaru line at Shuri Castle. Moving down against them, its regiments leapfrogging one another all along the pitiless way, the 1st Marine Division was exposed to almost constant fire from its left flank and struck unceasingly from its front. The deeper the advance, the more numerous and formidable became the defences in depth, the more difficult the terrain. On May 11th, the 1st began bucking at Dakeshi Ridge and Dakeshi Town. Both fell after a seesaw 3-day battle, the Americans plodding forward by day, the Japanese counter-attacking by night. Daylight sometimes meant a fresh attack to recover ground surrendered during the night. Platoons took a position at the cost of 3/4 of their men, then tried to hang on with the survivors. Sometimes they could not. In Dakeshi Town, the Marines found a labyrinth of tunnels, shafts and caves, with snipers everywhere among the ruins, crouching behind broken walls, hidden in wells or cisterns. But Dakeshi Town also fell, and on May 14th, the 1st Marine Division entered Wana Draw. Wana Draw was a long, narrowing ravine running east to Shuri. It was formed by the reverse slope of Wana Ridge on its left and the forward slope of another ridge to the right. All its low, gently rising ground was covered by gunfire, from its mouth 400 yards wide to the point at which, 800 yards east, it narrowed sharply between steep cliffs under the heights of Shuri. Although neither Shuri nor Shuri Castle was in the zone of the 1st Marine Division, but rather in the 77th Divisions, the plunging fire that fell from them was meant for the 1st Division's left flank. It was necessary for the 1st to face left or east and attack up Wana Draw, both to remove that thorn from its flesh and to knock out those powerful positions menacing the entire western half of the 10th Army front. Any attack south past Shuri would be struck in both flank and rear. On May 14th, the day on which Major Courtney led the charge on Sugarloaf, the 1st Marine Division began processing Wana Draw. A few tanks slipped into the ravine. They probed for the caves. Anti-tank fire fell on them. Supporting riflemen took the Japanese gunners under fire. Suicide troops rushed for the tanks, hurling satchel charges. Again, the supporting riflemen protected the tanks. But sometimes the anti-tank guns knocked out the tanks. Sometimes the Japanese infantrymen drove the Marine riflemen back. Sometimes the satchel charges blew up a tank. But when the tanks did gain a foothold, then the more vulnerable flame-throwing tanks rumbled in. They sprayed the hillside with fire, particularly those reverse slopes that could not be reached by bombs or artillery. Squads of foot marines went in after them, men with bazookas, flamethrowers, hand grenades, blocks of dynamite, peeling off team by team, taking cave after cave, crawling up to them under the protective fire of riflemen kneeling in the mud. More and more men went into Wana Draw. Day after day the division bucked against this barrier, but soon there were whole companies working up the slopes, processing caves and pillboxes, calling down their mortars and rifle grenades on the machine guns and mortars sure to be nesting on the reverse slope. It was war at its most basic, man-to-man, a battle fought by corporals and privates. And these were the men who won the Medals of Honor, while the 1st Division processed its way into Shuri. Private Dale Hanson, using a bazooka, a rifle and hand grenades to knock out a pillbox and a mortar position and kill a dozen Japanese before he lost his own life. PFC, Albert Schwab, attacking machine guns alone with his flamethrower, silencing them even as he perished. Corporal Louis Haug, doing the same with grenades, and also dying. With these men were their indomitable comrades of the Navy Medical Corps, men such as Corpsman William Halliburton, who deliberately shielded wounded Marines with his own body until his life leaked out of it. This was the fight for Wana Draw, that pitiless bloodletting swirling inside a gully, while the very elements howled about these men in muddy green floundering up the forward slopes, these men in smeared khaki sliding down the reverse slopes. At night, under cover of smoke screens, the men in khaki crept forward again to close with the men in green, to fight with bayonets and fists and strangling hands. But the men in khaki were losing the fight for Wana Draw. The Marines drew closer to Shuri. The soldiers of the 77th Division on their left were thrusting toward Shuri and Shuri Castle from the eastern gate. On the east flank, the 7th Infantry Division was back in the line and smashing into Yonabaru. The 6th Marine Division was again on the march to Naha on the west. All along the line, division and corps artillery were battering Ushijima's strongpoints. The 10th Army's Tactical Air Force roved over the battlefield at will, and the warships of the fleet were slugging away with the most formidable supporting fire yet laid down in the Pacific, for they had caught the hang of pasting those reverse slopes that land-air pounding could not reach. Ushijima's barrier line was buckling. On the eastern front from Conle Hill to Shuri Castle, the 96th and 77th Divisions were also driving slowly but doggedly into Ushijima's bristling defences, and with the 77th there marched perhaps the most unusual hero in the annals of American arms. His name was PFC Desmond Doss. He was a medic in the 307th Infantry. He was also a Seventh-day Adventist, a doctrinal pacifist who shrank from even touching a weapon and would not work on Saturday, his creed's Sabbath. As a conscientious objector, on religious grounds, he might have joined that corps of non-combatants who refused to serve their country on the battlefield. But Desmond Doss saw clearly that it was his duty to serve, and that he, too, could risk his flesh for his country without taking the life of a brother human. As a medic during his regiment's bitter battle on the Maida escarpment in late April, Doss distinguished himself by his utter disregard for his own safety and his devotion to his soldier buddies. Again and again he risked enemy fire to come to the side of stricken GIs, dressing their wounds and then dragging them to the edge of a cliff, where he fastened them to a rope sling of his own devising and lowered them to safety. He did this so often that some of his buddies, believing that he had a charmed life, sought to stay near him. For his gallantry, Doss received the Medal of Honor, a reproach to those who said, "I will not serve," and a credit to a nation that could bestow its highest military award on a brave pacifist. Doss was still with the 77th on May 11th, when that veteran division took on the chocolate Dropwort Hill Flattop Hill complex in the centre of the island. This forbidding position, almost as formidable as Sugarloaf, bristled with mortars and interlocking machine guns and 47mm anti-tank guns. Because Ushijima had added a protective minefield to its front, the 7th GIs, like the Marines at Sugarloaf, had to attack without tanks. Casualties were frightful. Colonel Aubrey Smith's 306th Regiment was bled so horribly that Smith was compelled to form the remnants, that is, about 800 men out of 2,400, into a single battalion. A similar Gethsemane awaited Colonel Stephen Hamilton's 307th after it relieved the 306th. As Hamilton's soldiers filed into place, one of them thought that the line of American dead sprawled atop Chocolate Drop looked like a skirmish line ready to leap erect and charge. As Doss had risked his life on the escarpment, he crawled bravely through enemy fire to succour the wounded. But there his charmed life ended when a bursting mortar shell mangled both his legs. Doss treated his own wounds, waiting 5 hours for stretcher-bearers to arrive. On the way to the battalion aid station, a fierce enemy barrage drove the bearers to cover. Lying alone on the litter, Doss saw a badly wounded GI untended, rolling from the stretcher to crawl to him and dress his wounds. While waiting for the bearers to return, Doss was hit again in the arm, suffering a compound fracture. Overcoming his horror of touching a gun, this indomitable youth actually made a splint for his arm from a rifle stock, and then squirmed 300 yards to the aid station, where he was treated and began to recover from his wounds. Such was the uncommon valour mixed with unique compassion that was common on Okinawa. On the 24th Corps' eastern flank above Buckner Bay, the 96th Division was driving against Conle Hill, and also Dick Hill just to the east of Flattop. Here stiff resistance had stalled both GIs of the 77th on their division's extreme left and those of the 96th on their own right. But on May 17th, an infantry platoon entered over a road cut between Dick and Flattop to explode enemy mines. They used bayonets to detonate the buried explosives, a risky tactic that cost 19 casualties. In the process, they sealed off 5 caves full of enemy soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Cyril Sterner of the 382nd 2nd Battalion realized at once that this lightly defended road was the key to the Japanese position. But it was heavily mined. Ingeniously, Sterner ordered 7 tons of Bangalore torpedoes, lengths of pipe packed with explosives, laid in the road's ruts and detonated, thus blasting all the mines. Now tanks could get into the rear of Dick and Flattop, assisted by flame-throwing tanks, and once the Americans were able to make such a penetration, they always turned the enemy flank. That was what was done at Flattop and Dick, and by May 21st, all that was needed for the 10th Army to pierce Ushijima's barrier line was for Colonel Eddie May's 382nd Infantry of the 96th Division to crack that hard nut known as Conle Hill. Conle Hill was the eminence holding down the easternmost flank of Ushijima's Naha-Shuri-Yonabaru barrier. If it fell to the Americans, it would unmask Yonabaru, the eastern terminus of the vital Yonabaru-Naha highway. If the 24th Corps did succeed in turning it, its troops could then meet the 2 Marine divisions of the 3rd Corps at Naha, thus effecting a double envelopment that might trap Ushijima before he could retreat farther south. Because of the importance of this position, General Hodge had chosen Colonel May, his best regimental commander, to direct the attack. Conle Hill's importance had not been lost on General Ushijima, and he had stationed 1,000 of his finest troops there, confident that they could not be dislodged. Most of them were concentrated in the hills and ridges to the west of Conle, where they expected the enemy to strike. Indeed, that was where May actually attempted his penetration. But the battalion May had assigned to that sector got nowhere in 10 days of fighting, while another assaulting Conle's north face had seized so much ground in 2 days that both Hodge and Buckner were delighted. Buckner actually joined May on May 13th to watch the Shermans blasting away at every fissure and crack of Conle's forward slope. Now E and F companies of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Stair's 2nd Battalion began to move out. Because E was slow getting started, the 2 platoons forming the spearhead of Lieutenant Owen O'Neill's F Company quickly reached their jump-off point. As an indication of the heavy casualties ravaging the 96th Company officers, these units were commanded by 2 technical sergeants, Guy Dale and Dennis Donovan. They waited for O'Neill, unaware that his radio was not working. Unwilling to delay longer, they went up Conle on their own initiative. There was little resistance, but the Americans were not deceived. Forward slopes were always a waltz. The real dance of death came screeching out the back door. Yet, to their surprise, not a soldier was hit as they climbed to a point about 50 feet below Conle's high round peak. Here they began to dig in, for to attempt to take Conle's tiny indefensible top would have drawn fire from every quarter. By one of those accidental strokes of luck that so often rule the battlefield, Donovan and Dale apparently had caught the Japanese in an unguarded moment. Perhaps the enemy had been preoccupied with those western hills. Whatever the excuse, the Americans had been given time to entrench themselves, and it was the chink and clink of those entrenching tools that alarmed Lieutenant Colonel Kensuke Udo. At once he ordered a counterattack. Out of the reverse slope poured the yelling Japanese, coming full tilt down the forward slope to be hammered to the ground. Now Lieutenant O'Neill joined his men, visibly and vocally pleased by the action of his alert sergeants, immediately calling for the tardy E Company under Captain Stanley Sutton to come up the hill and form a battlefront on F Company's right flank. 2 full companies, safely entrenched and supported by mortars below, now held a perimeter east of Conle's peak. Oddly enough, the Japanese did not counterattack that night. At 383rd's headquarters, a delighted Simon Bolivar Buckner congratulated Colonel May on what he described as one of the finest small unit manoeuvres he had ever witnessed. During the next 3 days, May 14th, 15 and 16, E and F companies, now joined by G, fought off the desperately counterattacking Japanese in a bitter battle on Conle's forward slope. Gradually the enemy, again charging through their own mortar shells, began to whittle Colonel Stair's battalion. At last, Major General Jim Bradley ordered Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Nolan's 3rd Battalion of the 381st Infantry to relieve Stair's valiant but fought-out dogfaces. It was a wise decision, for the belligerent Nolan sent his GIs driving down a hogback into Sugar Hill, and with the fall of that strong point, Conle Hill was in American hands. In 10 days between May 11th and 21, both sides had been locked in the fiercest fighting of this terrible Okinawa campaign, so hideously reminiscent of the trench warfare of World War I, both in its horrible human losses and the attempt of one side to pierce the defences of an enemy determined to yield not an inch. It was the unstoppable force against the immovable object. More clearly, in military terms, what always happens when firepower wielded by the valiant cannot fail to overwhelm spiritual power alone, no matter how valorous and dedicated its devotees. Casualties in the 77th Division were 239 killed, 1,212 wounded, and 16 missing. In the 96th Division, 138 killed, 1,059 wounded, and 9 missing. Japanese losses are not known, although they were probably twice this number, even though Ushijima's soldiers were on the defensive. Perhaps the greatest tribute to the American fighting men on Okinawa came from their favourite English-language broadcaster, Radio Tokyo, Sugarloaf Hill, Chocolate Drop, Strawberry Hill. Gee, these places sound wonderful. You can just see the candy houses with the white picket fences around them and the candy canes hanging from the trees, their red and white stripes glistening in the sun. But the only thing red about these places is the blood of Americans. Yes, sir, these are the names of hills in southern Okinawa, where the fighting's so close that you can get down to bayonets and sometimes your bare fists. I guess it's natural to idealize the worst places with pretty names to make them seem less awful. Why, Sugarloaf has changed hands so often it looks like Dante's Inferno. Yes, sir, Sugarloaf Hill, Chocolate Drop, Strawberry Hill. They sound good, don't they? Only those who've been there know what they're really like. True enough. But only the Yanks who were there really knew the final score. Major General John Hodge saw the lodgment on Conle Hill as an opportunity for a turning movement of Ushijima's eastern flank. He would use the rested 77th Division. Rested in that, withdrawn from combat, they had only to contend with mud, misery and malaria, to move along Buckner Bay's coastal flats without fear of plunging fire from Conle Hill. If the 77th could reach and capture Yonabaru, they could wheel west to join the Marine divisions moving around the enemy's western flank and so trap the 32nd Army in a double envelopment. It was an excellent concept and a distinct possibility, although 2 factors stood between the idea and its execution: renewed rain and Ushijima's unwillingness to sit still for destruction. On the night of May 22nd, with the 6th Marine Division across the Osato River and poised to break into Naha, there was another conference under Shuri Castle. Lieutenant General Ushijima had decided to retreat. He could no longer hold his Yonabaru-Shuri-Naha line. He would have to withdraw south of the Yonabaru-Naha Valley, abandoning even that fine cross-island road. Where to? Should it be the wild, roadless Chinin Peninsula on the east coast, or southernmost Kiyamu Peninsula? The wrangle began. In the end, the Kiyamu was chosen because of the strength of the Yaeju-Yuza peaks and the honeycombs of natural and artificial caves that could accommodate the entire 32nd Army for its final stand. The next day, Ushijima began reinforcing his flanks again to hold off the Americans while his withdrawal began, but he was too late to prevent the turning of the west flank at Naha. The 6th Division burst into the city's ruins and began its reduction. Ushijima still counterattacked the 7th Division on the east flank at Yonabaru, trying to relieve the pressure there, but the 7th's valiant dogfaces held fast. A nocturnal Kamikazi raid hurled at Okinawa shipping to coincide with Ushijima's land strikes was shattered, with 150 planes shot down in exchange for the loss of the destroyer transport Bates and 1 LSM, plus damage to 8 other ships. The most ferocious display of anti-aircraft power yet seen in the Pacific broke up a daring airborne attack on Yontan and Kadena airfields. It was an unusually clear night, and there were thousands of witnesses to this small savage setback that the suicide spirit was able to inflict on the Americans. Perhaps 20 twin-engined bombers came gliding through a fiery lacework woven by American anti-aircraft gunners. 11 of them fell in flames. The rest, except one, fled. That solitary Sally bomber skidded on its belly along one of Yontan's runways. When it stopped, 8 of 14 men of the Japanese 1st Air Raiding Brigade were dead in their seats, but 6 of them were alive, tumbling out the door, coming erect and sprinting for parked planes while hurling heat grenades and phosphorus bombs. They blew up 8 airplanes, damaged 26 others, destroyed 2 fuel dumps housing 70,000 gallons of gasoline, and killed 2 Marines and wounded 18 others before they were finally hunted down and killed. In the morning, the 10th Army was still grinding down toward the heart of Ushijima's defense in Shuri Castle. Marines of the 1st Division in Wanadraw began to draw swiftly closer to the city and its heights to their east. They began to notice Japanese sealing off caves and quitting the draw. At noon of May 26th, Major General Del Valle asked for an aerial reconnaissance over the Yonabaru-Naha Valley. He had a hunch the Japanese were pulling back from Shuri, trying to sneak out under cover of a heavy rain. A spotter plane from the battleship New York reported that the roads behind Shuri were packed. Between 3,000 and 4,000 Japanese were on the rear march with all their guns, tanks, and trucks. In 13 minutes, despite rain and bad visibility, the warships of the fleet were on the target. Soon 50 Marine Corsairs were with them, rocketing and strafing, and every Marine artillery piece or mortar within range had its smoking muzzle pointed toward the valley. They killed from 500 to 800 Japanese and littered the muddy roadways with wrecked vehicles. 3 days later, the Marines took Shuri Castle. It was not supposed to be theirs to take. It was the objective of the 77th Division, the very plum of the Okinawa fighting. But the 1st Marine Division took it anyway. General Del Valle sent a battalion of the 5th Marines climbing into Shuri on May 29th. He wanted to get around and behind the Japanese, still holding out in Wanadraw. The 1st Battalion quickly stormed Shuri Ridge to the east or left of the draw, so quickly that Lieutenant Colonel Charles Shelburne asked permission to go onto the castle 800 yards east. Del Valle granted it. The 77th Division was still 2 days hard fighting from the castle, and the chance was too good to ignore. The light defences around Shuri might be only a temporary lapse. Company A of the 5th Marines under Captain Julius Dusenbury began slogging east in knee-deep mud. Inside Captain Dusenbury's helmet was a flag, as had become almost customary among Marine commanders since the Suribachi flag-raising. While the Marines marched, Del Valle was just barely averting the 77th's planned artillery and aerial strike on Shuri Castle, and then Dusenbury's Marines overran a party of Japanese soldiers and swept into the castle courtyard, into the battered ruins of what had once been a beautiful palace with curving, tiered roofs of tile. They ran up to its high parapet, and over this Captain Dusenbury flew his flag. Shuri Castle, the key bastion of the Okinawa defences, was in American hands, and if the 77th Division was irritated, if the 10th Army was displeased, the soldier who commanded the Americans on Okinawa could not be entirely annoyed. The flag that Captain Dusenbury of South Carolina flew was the flag of Simon Bolivar Buckner's father. The stars and bars, not the stars and stripes, waved over Okinawa. 2 days later, Old Glory was in its rightful place. General Del Valle sent a party with the standard of the 1st Marine Division, the one that had flown over Guadalcanal, New Britain, and Peleliu. Now, above Shuri Castle, not far from the spot where Commodore Perry had hoisted the American flag a century ago, the most victorious flag of the Pacific was caught and flung in the breeze. The Japanese retreating to the south could see it. They fired on it, missing. They kept firing, for they understood that the terrible power it symbolized was already massing to come south and destroy them. Plane and pilot losses in the 5th Air Fleet and 6th Air Army had been so severe that in Japan a special Kamikazi Corps had been organized. Replacements in both machines and men were fed from bases in central and northern Nippon to Kyushu. Often these aviators were hardly more than raw recruits whose training periods were of short duration. At first, the Kamikazi had been strictly volunteers, but as the Okinawa campaign continued, all Japanese sailors and soldiers were subject to suicide duty, whether or not they wished to go. Sometimes commanders volunteered their entire units for this not always desirable service. More and more glorious young eagles began to get lost and returned to base. Others who went willingly were frustrated by frequent engine trouble or the weather. These were the ardent, idealist youths, such as the pilot who left the verse. "When I fly the skies, what a fine burial place would be the top of a cloud." Others were not so eager to make the supreme sacrifice, like the one who wrote, "I say frankly, I do not die willingly. I die not without regret. My country's future leaves me uneasy. I am terribly distressed." Much of the glamour of the Special Attack Forces had faded. Its members were still idolized, of course, and there was always a ceremony for the final departure. Toasts of sake to be drunk and cigarettes from the imperial gift to be smoked. Hirohito's parting benefaction upon his private army of assassins. But the scourging of the Kyushu bases by American air power had turned these once thriving and stimulating centres into dreary, dismal limbos where the Kamikazi awaiting the death order escaped boredom, or depression, by helping local farmers with their spring planting. Rain, it seemed, always brought the Kamikazi, and on May 11th, as the 10th Army assault slogged and slipped forward, the growl and grumble and whistling rain of the great Luchu's skies were a welcome sound to about 150 Japanese aircraft hurtling south from Kyushu. Those who were believing Shintoists said a prayer of thanksgiving to the sun goddess for having providentially averted her face, forgetting in their gratitude the disaster that had crippled their attack at its outset. A formation of Judy bombers climbing from Kokobu Airfield's Airstrip 2 crashed into a formation of Val Kamikazi, taking off from another runway, with a total loss of 15 planes. The remaining 135, however, continued to roar south for Okinawa and TF-58. Those that reached Picket Station 15 about 7:50 a.m. were delighted to sight 2 enemy destroyers clearly visible below them. They were the Evans and Hugh W. Hadley, commanded by Naval Academy classmates Commanders Robert Archer in Evans and Baron Mullaney in Hadley. They watched in apprehension as no less than 50 Kamikazi peeled off to begin orbiting above them, and when they began to dive, there ensued probably the classic ship-airplane battle of World War II. For an hour and a half without let-up, Evans and Hadley fought off 50 Kamikazi. Hadley alone shot down 23 of them, while Evans claimed 15. The Marines from Yontan and Kadena knocked another 19 out of the skies. Commander Mullaney of Hadley called for Marines to help him. Back came the squadron leader's answer. "I'm out of ammunition, but I'm sticking with you." He did, flying straight into a flurry of 10 Kamikazi coming at Hadley fore and aft, trying to head them off, while other Marines of his squadron rode down through the Attack with stuttering guns. They were not always successful, for both of these tough little ships took 4 Kamikazi hits apiece. But they survived to be towed to that anchorage in Kerama-Reto that had become a vast hospital ward for stricken and maimed American ships, and there Commander Mullaney could write this tribute to the Yontan and Kadena flyers. "I am willing to take my ship to the shores of Japan if I could have these Marines with me." Meanwhile, another 50 Kamikazi had found Task Force 58. On the bridge of his flag carrier Bunker Hill, Admiral Mark Mitcher watched in open admiration as the Japanese pilots skillfully used rain clouds and window to deceive the American radar. He frowned as a Zero Kamikazi plane broke from low clouds on the carrier's starboard quarter, smashing through rows of planes on the flight deck to start fires before crashing overboard and exploding. Behind it came a Judy diving straight down from astern. It hit at the worst possible moment, with armed planes refuelling on the flight deck. While a broken fuel line fed a roaring fire, these planes exploded like a burst from a giant machine gun. In a few moments, 400 sailors were killed or blown out of sight, and another 264 wounded. Even so, Bunker Hill's ordeal did not quite equal the agony of Franklin, although there was just as much heroism in the fight to douse her flames and keep her afloat. Machinist's mate Jack Salvaggio would forever bless the porthole in the ship's stencil room that he had so fervently cursed for the wind blowing through it to scatter his papers. Now he wriggled through this passport to continued life. Another machinist named Harold Fraught believed he was trapped in a smoke-filled passageway until he saw a tiny open porthole. I was about to reach it but couldn't, and I was just about to give up when someone pushed me through. I sure would like to find out who it was who kept pushing every guy through but not saving himself. For 512 hours, Bunker Hill's gallant crew fought the flames threatening to consume and sink their ship. Splendid seamanship saved her, heeling from a list to starboard to one to port. The great vessel gradually combined gravity and gathering momentum to send a huge mass of burning gasoline and oil, water and foam, sloshing slowly from the hangar deck overboard into the sea. At this point, Admiral Mitcher transferred his flag from Bunker Hill, the second worst hit ship in the Navy to survive, though she would need many months of repair, to the more famous Enterprise. Next day, the Kikusui struck again, but not nearly with as much savagery as on May 11th, scoring only one hit on the Batch, a radar picket ship far south of Okinawa, knocking out its power plant and killing 41 sailors. Nevertheless, Admiral Spruance was alarmed by the renewed fury of the floating chrysanthemums and ordered Mitcher to take 2 task groups north to work over the Kyushu airfields. Mitcher did, introducing a naval novelty in the night-flying Air Group 90 aboard Enterprise, which gave the weary Japanese airmen no rest. Mitcher also struck hard at Ugaki's northern airfields, shifting his sights from the enemy's battered southern bases. Meanwhile, Corsairs and Hellcats ranged among enemy interceptors like devouring wolves, while the torpedo-launching Avengers and Helldiver dive bombers ravaged no less than 34 of Ugaki's air bases. Still, the Kamikazi fought back. On May 14th, a flight of 84 fighters zoomed aloft as cover for 26 Zero Kamikaze planes bent on punishing TF-58 for its audacious strikes at the homeland. A pre-takeoff briefing could not have been briefer. 3 words: get the carriers. Young Lieutenant Tomai Kai could not forget this command as he roared aloft in his bomb-laden Zero. To his delight, he soon found himself above TF-58 and a monster carrier. He had no way of knowing that this was Enterprise, the Big E, one of the most battle-seasoned flat-tops of World War II, but he didn't hesitate to jump her despite the bucking and bouncing of his frail craft from enemy ack-ack exploding around him. Bursting from a cloud at 1,500 feet, Kai pointed his Zero's nose at the Big E's stern and opened his throttle, miraculously passing unscathed through a storm of 20 and 40 mm tracers flowing toward him. Standing on the carrier's bridge, Admiral Mitcher's calculating eye calmly watched the enemy's approach. 200 yards astern, Lieutenant Kai flip-flopped his aircraft upside down just as he passed over Enterprise, and then, to steepen his dive, yanked the stick all the way back. Just before he crashed into the carrier's flight deck at an angle of 50 degrees, he released his 550-pound bomb. The missile plunged straight down the yawning elevator well, exploding with a monstrous roar that sent the elevator roof spinning lazily into the sea. Fortunately, most of the crewmen above deck were wearing flash-proof clothing, so that only a few men were badly burned in comparison to the horrible scorching of Franklin's crewmen. Moreover, only 13 were killed and 69 wounded. Big E's alert crewmen had prepared their ship for attack. Fuel lines had been drained and filled with CO2. Aircraft had been disarmed, drained of fuel, and stowed below. Compartments had been made watertight by dogging down the bulkheads, and emergency rations were stored within them. Best of all, when flames did erupt, the firefighting details were ready for them. Thus, when Admiral Mitscher on his flag bridge stared quizzically at the hole left in the flight deck by Kai's Zero, he was not dismayed. Instead, he removed the long-visored baseball cap he always wore, scratched his bald head, and said, "Tell my task group commanders that if the Japanese keep this up, they're going to grow hair on my head yet." Mark Mitscher also would cherish a calling card found on the intact corpse of the heroic young Lieutenant Tomai Kai, who had come so close to sinking the Admiral's flagship. Following the failure of the floating chrysanthemum operation that included the airborne attack on Yontan Kadena and Lieutenant Kai's crash dive on Enterprise, the 5th Air Fleet was so short of planes and pilots that it pressed into service 20 Shinrigaku twin-engine trainers. These awkward aircraft, certainly no match for the swift and sturdy American fighters, comprised most of the aircraft deployed in Kikusui 7 on May 24th. No decision could have been more indicative of the desperation of Ugaki and Sugahara. They would not only lose the invaluable pilots and crew trainers of the Shinrigaku, but have few instructors remaining to teach the low-quality recruits being dragooned in the north and sent to Kyushu. And they did lose them, as the Marine Corsairs roved among them with stuttering guns. Nevertheless, Kikusui 7 did hold the destroyer storms, while damaging the destroyer transports Bates and Barry so badly that Bates sank and Barry was converted to a kamikaze decoy. But the Divine Winds were back on May 27-28 for floating Chrysanthemum 8, a novelty in that, on the 27th, some 85 Army and Navy aircraft attacked at night. Here was a demonstration of how inept aircraft designed for daytime combat can be fighting in darkness. Picket destroyers Anthony and Brain firing on radar quickly took out an indefinite number of invisible assailants, identified only by gasoline fires on black water. Wisely, the others waited until dawn to renew the assault, slightly damaging Anthony and mangling Brain to kill about 100 American seamen and wounding about the same number. The next day in clearing weather, the Kikusui were back, this time swooping again on their favourite target, the ships of Radar Picket Station 15. Destroyers Drexler and Lowry were hit and staggered, but above them Marine Corsairs were plucking petals from the chrysanthemums. Lieutenants R.F. Bourne and J.B. Seaman each downed a red-balled enemy, while Seaman exploded a third. As both pilots joined to attack a fourth, peeling the enemy's metal hide, its pilot maintained control and plunged into Drexler with an impact that sent flames shooting hundreds of feet high. Within a minute, Drexler rolled over and sank, taking 158 men down with her. Reports of this disaster made eyelids flutter in Washington. Had the enemy perfected a new and fearful explosive? The answer came from a board of inquiry that preferred to believe, and probably correctly, that a heavy bomb striking a ship's magazine could easily produce such a violent fireball. After May 28th, Admiral Ugaki fully intended to continue his Kikusui attacks, still believing that Admiral Spruance now commanded a ghost fleet of floating wrecks and derelicts. But then bad weather and the army's disenchantment with the floating chrysanthemums, the generals had always believed that Japanese air power should be husbanded for homeland defense, interfered with his plans. To his dismay, General Sugahara and his 6th Air Army were removed from Navy control. He still had the cooperation of the Army's 3rd Air Division, however, and planned to resume what can only be described as his graveyard operation with Kikusui 9 on June 3rd. Before then, American air power received a powerful reinforcement in the arrival of a squadron of Army P-47 Thunderbolts. Here was a fighter unrivaled for its speed, armament, armour, and climbing power. On May 28th, a flight of 8 Thunderbolts under Captain John Vogt jumped 28 Zeros forming in a Loughbury circle, a defensive aerial tactic perhaps copied from a ring of show horses moving tail to nose. Thus, each Zero was to protect the tail of the plane ahead. Because the Zero with its light armament and thin armour was fast and manoeuvrable, these pilots probably thought they were safe from attack, but the thunderbolts climbing at full throttle moved high above their quarry at 28,000 feet, and then came screaming down in a dive that sent 6 of the enemy flaming into the sea, along with 2 probables. Captain Vogt claimed to have accounted for 5 of them. Floating Chrysanthemum 9 did take to the skies on June 3rd, supposedly with about 101 aircraft, but this seems unlikely. The naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison gives only 50. Whatever their number, it was sharply reduced by the Yontan Cadena Marine Corsairs, succeeding only in holing a mine layer. The next day, the Kamikazi dove again, but in almost negligible strength. Once again, the unfortunate Anthony was their target. To the crew's unbelieving eyes, a Kamikazi plane barely nicked by gunfire actually bailed out. This most unwarlike tactic, however, availed him nothing. His parachute streamed after him unopened to mark his plunge into the briny. Another plane dived at Anthony, but her 40mm gunners shot it down. Kikusui 9 suggested that attrition of the 5th Air Fleet, raids from Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Guam and the fast carriers, was almost complete. Admiral Ugaki, who had started in April with a fleet of more than 4,000 aircraft, was now in June down to about 1,270, of which only 570 were serviceable, and these marked for conventional duty. Only a handful of Kamikazi remained. Nevertheless, this relentless, not to say merciless, Air Admiral prepared Floating Chrysanthemum 10. With Okinawa already doomed, it was scheduled for June 21, 22. Supposedly, 58 to 45 Kamikazi had been collected, escorted by an unknown number of fighters. Also aboard were 6 Baka bombs, Ugaki's masterpiece. How many of them aborted and returned to base is not known, but by late June, abortion was becoming nearly as popular as divine death had been. This last attack of the deadly floating chrysanthemums produced only a few near misses, while one faithful Kamikazi pilot set the seaplane tender, Curtis afire, and another struck at Barry, the previously damaged destroyer escort converted to decoy duty as it was being towed to its station by LSM-50, sinking both ships. Meanwhile, the Baka Brigade was a complete fizzle. 2 failed to release from their mother planes and were returned to Kyushu, while the other 4 were either lost when their mother planes were shot down, or harmed nothing but a few dozen fishes. Thus the inglorious end of the Kikusui that were to save Japan. Japan's third divine wind had spent itself on the sturdy ships and stout hearts of the United States Naval Service. It was the month of June, the month of Ushijima's last stand. Lieutenant General Buckner had redisposed his 10th Army for the final heave of the war. On the west or right flank, the Marines' sector had been narrowed. The 6th Marine Division was going to make a shore-to-shore amphibious assault on the Oroku Peninsula in the southwest, and the 1st Marine Division had not the strength to cover the entire 3rd Corps front. The 3rd Corps, in fact, was depleted. With the 2nd Marine Division sent back to Saipan, rather than kept afloat as a kamikaze target, Major General Geiger had not been able to rest either the 1st or the 6th. He had no reserve, and the divisions themselves had tried to maintain battle efficiency by resting one regiment while the other 2 attacked. But it could not always be done. So the 3rd Corps needed troops, and soon the 8th Regiment of the 2nd Marine Division would be brought into Okinawa to furnish them. But this was not until after the 8th had finished capturing islands to the west of Okinawa to give Admiral Turner long-range radar and fighter director stations. The 24th Corps was in better shape. Major General Hodge had 3 divisions, exclusive of the 27th on garrison in the north, and had been able to rest one while the other 2 were attacking. Only infrequently, as in the final days before Shuri, were all 3 in the line. But from June 4th onward, the 24th Corps was grinding down on the Yaesu-Yuzu peaks, where most of the 32nd Army's remnants had holed up. Even General Ushijima was here, conducting the last stand from his headquarters cave just above the ocean. June 5th was a sad day for General Hodge, for on that date his favourite regimental commander, Colonel Eddie May, fell dead with an enemy machine gunner's bullet through his heart. Hodge had called May the finest soldier I have ever known, and though he was indeed a hard 'un, the courageous calm with which he would stand exposed to enemy fire while studying Japanese positions was legendary. 2 weeks later, the 96th Division lost another brave leader, Brigadier General Claudius Easley, Assistant Division Commander. As usual, this brave little gamecock was up front scouting the enemy, and just as he pointed out an enemy machine gun, a burst from that very weapon that ended him. On the same day that Easley was killed, the final Medal of Honor was won on Okinawa. Technical Sergeant John Meagher of the 77th 305th Infantry was mounted on a tank directing its fire when a Japanese soldier wielding a satchel charge rushed at him. Dropping to the ground, Meagher bayoneted his assailant, then ran back to his Sherman to fire a machine gun at a pair of Japanese machine guns. Emptying his gun's belt, Meagher seized his 35-pound weapon as though it were a baseball bat to club the remaining enemy gunners to death. Casualties in the 96th had been far from light as the division ground south on the honeycomb of caves and fortified peaks that was the Yaiju Yuza. Its rifle battalions were so reduced in strength that General Hodge, to maintain the division's momentum, transferred the 77th 305th Infantry to the 96th. When the GIs of the 24th Corps began to penetrate the enemy cave strongholds, many of them were sickened with what they found. The caves were full of men and misery. There were many sick and dying. Some caves had become reeking pest holes. As many as 40 men lay in some of these hillside warrens. At times, a doctor or a corpsman came around to ask how they felt. They could do little more. They had no supplies. Men died from wounds not considered serious. Filth accumulated. The rain drummed outside. Water streamed into the caves, and the wounded nearly drowned. The smell was so overpowering that men could hardly breathe. Still, Ushijima was determined to fight on. He shared the fanaticism of those army diehards who were even then, in that month of June, attempting to wreck the peace party that the new premier, Baron Kantaro Suzuki, was forming with the secret encouragement of Emperor Hirohito. Tokyo had been savaged twice more, on May 23rd and 25, and the emperor was now genuinely dismayed by the slaughter among his people. But General Ushijima and General Cho, resuming their old relationship, were capable of no such dismay. The fight was to be to the finish, and on June 4th the 10th Army shuddered and drove forward. On that date, the 6th Marine Division's spearheads shoved off from Naha to make the last marine amphibious assault of World War II. Again the Amtraks, wallowing in the sea waves, the naval gunfire thundering overhead, the shores of the objective winking and spouting smoke, and in they went to conquer 3x2 Oroku Peninsula in a whirling 10-day battle. Again, beaches, coral pinnacles, caves, hills, tunnel systems, 5,000 last-ditch Japanese to be killed, an admiral to be driven to suicide, and again death and wounds for Marines, 1,608 of them. Oroku was the Pacific War in microcosm, even in its medals of honor. Private Robert McTurius attacking machine guns, firing on stretcher-bearers, and losing his life to save his buddies. Corpsman Fred Lester continuing to treat wounded Marines while dying of his own wounds. But Oroku ended in a rout after Admiral Ota committed harakiri. On June 13th, the Japanese threw down their arms and fled toward the mainland in the southeast. They could not escape. The 1st Marine Division had driven past the base of the peninsula and sealed it off. The Japanese began surrendering. Beneath Oroku, the 1st had broken through to the south coast. Okinawa had been sliced down the middle, but more important to those weary, hungry Marines who did it was the sea outlet to which Amtraks could now bring supplies. The men had been a week on reduced rations, slogging through the mud that made supply nearly impossible. On the eastern flank, the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions were also nearing the southern coast. Lieutenant General Buckner had already made a surrender appeal to Ushijima. He had had a letter dropped behind the lines. It said, The forces under your command have fought bravely and well, and your infantry tactics have merited the respect of your opponents. Like myself, you are an infantry general long-schooled and practiced in infantry warfare. I believe, therefore, that you understand as clearly as I that the destruction of all Japanese resistance on the island is merely a matter of days. The letter was dropped on June 10th. It reached Ushijima and Cho on June 17th. They thought it hilarious. How could a samurai surrender? Ushijima and Cho had already resigned themselves to harakiri by that 17th of June, for by then all was over. On the west flank, the 1st Marine Division was battling through Kunishi Ridge, while the 6th had again come into line on the right and was racing for Ara Point, the southernmost tip of Okinawa. In the east, the 96th Division was finishing off resistance in the Yaesu-Yuzu peaks, and the 7th Division's soldiers were closing in on the 32nd Army's very headquarters. There was nothing left for Ushijima and Cho, save the satisfying news the next day that the American who had insulted them with a surrender offer was himself dead. Simon Bolivar Buckner had come down to Mazado Ridge to see the fresh 8th Marine Regiment enter battle. The 8th had come to Okinawa on June 15th after seizing Admiral Turner's radar outposts and was attached to the 1st Division. As had happened in the beginning at Guadalcanal, when another regiment of the 2nd Division was attached to the 1st, so it was happening in the end at Okinawa. Colonel Clarence Wallace sent the 8th Marines in at Kunishi Ridge. They were to attack in columns of battalions to seize a road, to split the enemy in two, to carry out General Del Valle's plans for a decisive thrust to the sea. Lieutenant General Buckner joined Colonel Wallace on Mazado Ridge at noon. He watched the Marines for about an hour. They moved swiftly on their objective. Buckner said, "Things are going so well here, I think I'll move on to another unit." 5 Japanese shells struck Mazado Ridge. They exploded and filled the air with flying coral. A shard pierced General Buckner's chest, and he died within 10 minutes, knowing at least that his 10th Army was winning. Command went to Roy Geiger, senior officer and about to be promoted to lieutenant general. The grizzled white bear who had been at Guadalcanal in the beginning was leading at the end on Okinawa. That came 3 days later. On June 21st, a patrol from the 6th Marine Division reached a small mound atop a spiky coral cliff. It was the tip of Ara Point. Beneath them were the mingling waters of the Pacific Ocean and the East China Sea. A few more days of skirmishing and a reverse mop-up drive to the north remained. When these were over and the last of the Kamikazi had been shot down, the Japanese 32nd Army was no more, with roughly 100,000 dead, and, surprisingly, another 10,000 captured. American casualties totaled 49,151, with Marine losses at 2,938 dead or missing and 13,708 wounded. The Armies at 4,675 and 18,099, and the Navies at 4,907 and 4,824. There was little left of Japanese air power after losses of about 3,000 planes, about 1,900 of them kamikaze, against 763 for the Americans, and the sinking of Yamato and 15 other ships meant the end of Nippon's navy. Though the United States Navy had been staggered with 36 ships sunk and another 368 damaged, there were still plenty left to mount the fall invasion of Kyushu from Okinawa. So the Great Luchu fell to the Americans after 83 days of fighting. A few hours after the Marine Patrol reached Ara Point, Major General Geiger declared organized resistance to be at an end. On the night of June 21st, the day General Geiger declared the American victory on Okinawa, Ushijima and Cho realized in their headquarters under Hill 95 near the Pacific Ocean that the end had come. Soldiers of Colonel John Finn's 32nd Infantry of the 7th Division were still dropping hand grenades through a vertical air shaft from the top of the hill. The explosives had already killed or wounded 10 officers. Neither Ushijima nor Cho wished to meet a similar fate at the hands of the American devils. They would take their own lives in the accepted samurai ceremony. Colonel Yahara had desired to join them in harakiri, but Ushijima had decreed that his planning officer, with his excellent memory and habit of straightforward reporting, should be the only man to attempt to escape to Tokyo with a full account of what had happened on Okinawa. Unfortunately, in his physique and bearing, Hiromichi Yahara was also the worst possible choice. No matter how he sought to disguise himself, this tall and patrician officer would stand out among the diminutive Okinawan population like a green tree in a petrified forest, and he was quickly captured. Being a samurai, he had probably asked for a bayonet with which to make the act of expiation like so many other captured samurai before him. If he had, he certainly would have been laughingly refused. That night, under Hill 95, Lieutenant Generals Ushijima and Cho, together with their ranking officers, consumed a farewell dinner prepared for them by the commander's cook, Tetsuo Nakamuta. It began with bean-curd soup and then proceeded to a bountiful repast of rice, canned meats, potatoes, fried fish cakes, fresh cabbage, and a dessert of canned pineapple. Sake flowed as freely as the lively conversation. At the meal's end, Isamu Cho produced from his large stock of liquors a bottle of black and white scotch, with which he and his chief solemnly toasted each other. It was agreed that nothing should be allowed to interfere with the ritual suicide of Ushijima and Cho. Thus, in the early morning hours just before moonrise, the officers and men of 32nd Army Headquarters would deliver the last banzai of World War II, a climbing charge up Hill 95, and after that, if there were any survivors, the town of Mabuni. At about 3 a.m. of June 22nd, 1945, with a glowing white moon polishing the gleaming black waters of the Pacific, and with Ushijima's staff singing Umi Yukaba, the members of the last banzai began climbing the cliff. Behind them at his desk, Ushijima wrote his last message to Tokyo. Our strategy, tactics and techniques all were used to the utmost. We fought valiantly, but it was as nothing before the material strength of the enemy. Cho wrote, 22nd day, 6th month, 20th year of the Showa era. I depart without regret, fear, shame, or obligations. Army Chief of Staff Cho, Army Lieutenant General Cho, Isamu, age of departure 52 years. At this time and place I hereby certify the foregoing. Bowing to his chief, Cho said, Well, Commanding General Ushijima, as the way may be dark, I, Cho, will lead the way. Returning the bow, Ushijima replied, Please do so. I will take along my fan since it is getting warm. An hour later, Ushijima and Cho stepped through a fissure in the cliff face overlooking the ocean. It was about 6 feet high and 6 feet wide, opening upon a small ledge above the water. Both wore their dress uniforms, complete with medals and sabre. A white quilt and a white sheet symbolizing death were laid over the ledge. Above them, the moon had begun its descent. They strolled out to the ledge, Ushijima calmly fanning himself. They bowed in reverence to the eastern sky, the customary obeisance to the emperor, and sat together on the white sheet and quilt. Only 100 feet behind them were the approaching American soldiers. Having heard voices, they began hurling grenades, unaware that the Japanese generals were so close to them. First Ushijima and then Cho bared their bellies to the upward thrust of the ceremonial knives in their hands. Upon the sight of blood, the adjutant standing by with unsheathed sabre delivered the coup de grace. 2 shouts, 2 sabre flashes, and it was done. And the moon began sinking into an obsidian sea. Truth trying to overtake falsehood is like the sound of an explosion seeking to catch up with the flash, and this seems to be especially true of that greatest myth of World War II, the belief that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August 1945 compelled Japan to surrender. There is no question that these dreadful fireballs ushering in the age of the mushroom cloud had much to do with Emperor Hirohito's decision to order his imperial conference to accept the Allied surrender offer. But before they were dropped, as has been suggested at the beginning of this narrative, Japan was already a defeated and demoralized nation, deeply divided between the diehards fiercely determined to continue the conflict regardless of the costs, and those timid members of the peace party who realized that the end had come, but who still feared to risk the wrath of the firebrands. The atomic bombings, then, brought Hirohito to their side and encouraged them to defy the warlords. But the fact remains that before then, before Okinawa, Japan was already beaten. This was the conclusion of the most authoritative voice on the subject, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey created by President Harry Truman to assess the effects of Allied bombing in World War II. It declared, based on a detailed investigation of surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the survey's opinion that certainly prior to 31st December 1945, and in all probability prior to 1st November 1945, Japan would have surrendered, even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. No judgment could be more unequivocal. Why, then, were the bombs dropped? Debate still rages over whether or not Japan should have been so ravaged. Harry Truman, to his dying day, insisted that he never had any doubt about the necessity of striking Nippon with atomic weapons. However, recent examination of his private papers produced a letter to his sister in which he wrote, "It was a terrible decision." Some critics claim that Japan was chosen rather than Germany because it was an Oriental nation, ignoring the fact that the Nazis had been destroyed in May, 2 months before the Fat Boy on its tower at Alamogordo flashed upward with a light not of this world, or that the thickening mood of savage revenge that had seized the American public had to be satisfied. Apart from such emotional conclusions, it should be obvious that the atomic bomb kept Stalin out of Western Europe and forced him to walk softly in Asia. This was indeed a strategic consideration of the highest order, one that no sincere statesman could refuse to balance against the hideous loss of life and property that would ensue under the mushroom cloud. Together with the certainty that American declarations of desiring peace and prosperity for all peoples would henceforth have to be read in the light of those terrible fireballs. Nevertheless, the atomic bombs did indeed keep the Soviet Union out of Western Europe and curtailed its ambitions in the Far East, even though they also presented the Soviets with a powerful psychological stick with which to beat the United States and its free world allies. To these considerations must be added the convictions of many high-ranking naval and air commanders, none of them members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that Japan could be bombed, shelled, and blockaded into submission. This is probably true, but can never be proved. At best, such a policy would indubitably have saved many American lives, even though it would almost certainly have caused horrible and unimaginable suffering in Japan. Because it would have taken so much longer, it would have given the insatiably land-hungry Stalin the opportunity to enter the war for a much longer period than his actual 6-day contribution, and thus cloak him in the customary mane of the lion roaring for his rightful share of the spoils. Hiroshima, then, did save Japan from the brutal and selfish policies of her warlords determined that the nation must die like a dutiful samurai. But Nagasaki was absolutely unnecessary, coming only 3 days after Hiroshima and thus too close to influence any decision. Probably it was dropped to show Japan that the United States possessed more than one bomb. Actually, it had only 2, and presumably could produce many more. From all this speculation, only 2 probabilities seem to emerge. One, that Japan was already beaten and would have surrendered before the monster Operation Olympic Invasion began 3 months later. 2, that Harry Truman dropped both bombs as much to frighten Stalin as to finish off Japan. Where, then, does this leave Okinawa? A corollary of the myth of the atomic bombs is the other, though less widespread, misconception of Okinawa as an unnecessary battle. Here is one more instance of that cart before the horse thinking common to those facile minds so well described by Aristotle. Contemplating little, they have no difficulty deciding. The battle for Okinawa was begun on April 1, 1945, more than 4 months before the bombing of Hiroshima, and 3 months before the first bomb was exploded at Alamogordo. The Americans wanted Okinawa for a staging area only 375 miles from Kyushu, The Japanese hoped through its Kamikazi corps either to cripple or destroy the enemy sea power that had brought the Americans so close to Japan proper. Because Imperial General Headquarters had not the slightest suspicion that the Americans were close to producing an atomic bomb, General Ushijima and his 32nd Army expected to defend Okinawa with conventional weapons, while General Buckner intended to seize the Great Lu Chu with the same instruments of war. Not until just before Hiroshima were Fleet Admiral Nimitz and General of the Armies MacArthur, the officers who would command the invasion of Japan, informed that their country now possessed atomic weapons. By then, of course, Okinawa had fallen, and when it did, it so shocked Emperor Hirohito that he could echo what Fleet Admiral Osami Nagano, his personal naval advisor, had cried when he learned of the loss of Saipan. "Hell is on us." Until Okinawa, Hirohito had been an accomplice of the warlords, if not a willing one, then, in the words of MacArthur, who came to know him better than any other Westerner, a figurehead, but not quite a stooge. After its fall, he was ready to challenge them, and the atomic bombs gave him that opportunity. So Okinawa was indeed decisive, for if the Japanese had won in this biggest battle of the Pacific War, the hold of the warlords upon the nation of Nippon would have been so strengthened that even the influence of Hirohito could not have persuaded the Imperial Conference to accept the Allied surrender offer. Thus, the war would have been prolonged, hopelessly for Japan, of course, and only the production and use of more atomic bombs would have avoided that titanic clash of arms upon the Tokyo plain.